الآن يمكنكم المشاركة في مبادرة الأيام الرقمية تحت شعار انطلق بقوة مع جوجل، والتي يتناول فيها خبراء جوجل عناوين جديدة أسبوعيا مثل السحابيات، مهارات من جوجل، أندرويد، فلتر، ذكاء الآلة، فايربيس، ديزاين ثينكينج، مقسمة إلى دورات وورشات عمل يومية بالإضافة إلى مسابقات أسبوعية. شاهد الأيام الرقمية مباشرة على اليوتيوب وشارك رأيك وأسئلتك مع خبراء جوجل، واحصل على شهادة حضور في كل محاضرة تشترك فيها. هذا وأكثر من الأحد إلى الخميس ابتداء من الساعة 9 بتوقيت دبي عبر الرابط المبين youtube.com/gdgmena.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أزول في الأول. Good evening everyone. معكم عليان عبد النور جي دي جي تيزي وزو الجزائر. اليوم إن شاء الله راح نتعلموا أشياء جديدة عن جوجل كلاود، عن الكلاود، عن لينكس، عن أشياء كثيرة، وهي حلقة من حلقات مبادرة المينا ديجيتال دايز للعام الثاني. العام الثاني، العام من قبل هو يعني في الحقيقة هو العام الثالث، لكن كنت معكم في العام الماضي، تعرفنا على الكثير من الأشياء من جوجل كلاود. عام سنة إن شاء الله راح سنتعلم أشياء جديدة أخرى، لكن العام الحالي بإذن الله سنقوم بإنشاء application from scratch. يعني سنذهب واحدة واحدة من تعلم لينكس إلى تعلم HTML ثم إلى بايثون، ثم سنقوم بعمل الابليكيشن على الكلاود، وسنتعرف على الكثير من الأشياء خلال هذا العام بإذن الله. سأكون معكم مرة كل شهر بإذن الله، وسنتعلم الكثير. وطبعا إذا كانت لديكم أي أسئلة يمكنكم طرحها في الشات. Hello everyone, Azul everyone. I will be with you, Aliane Abdenour, GDG Tiziuzu from Algeria, and we are going to learn a lot of stuff about Google Cloud and everything you need to learn about the IT system, about computer stuff that we have in 2022 and about the future. I will be with you within this hour, where we are going to discover what is Linux and how we are going to tie this concept about Linux to cloud. We will be here once every month, and then I will be with you, inshallah. All this year, we are going to create an application, and then we are going to learn a lot of stuff about it, and then we are going to host it on the cloud. So stay tuned. And of course, if you have any question, don't hesitate, please ask them. So today we are going to see what is Linux. So of course, everyone is hearing about Linux. This is the trend. All people from the IT are talking about Linux, but we need to understand, why do we need Linux? What is Linux? So for this, everything started from this guy, Linus Torvalds. This guy started everything. So when we say Linux, Linux is not an operating system. Linux, this is a kernel. So we need to fix some keywords that we need to use between each other, because when we say, hey, I know how to use Linux, this is not the right word we need to use. We need to use now new words that I will show you in this session, that we are going to change our vocabulary to fit to the community and to make more IT guy than a normal guy. So Linus Torvalds, he was at the university. He saw a lot of because in the past operating systems were only exclusive for universities and big brands, so he tried to make his own operating system. And before doing the operating system, we need something that we call a kernel. So the kernel, this is this part. So when we, for example, we have Windows. So before we run what we are seeing right now, we have Google Chrome, we have this mouse, we have everything. So we have the hardware here. So the hardware, to be able to talk to software, they need something. And this thing, this is what we call the kernel. So the kernel, this is the heart of our operating system. The kernel, this is what is protecting us from doing bad stuff to the hardware. So the kernel asks the software, don't do that. I will never let you do that, but I can do that. So when we install, for example, a driver for a camera, or for example, for a new mouse, that electricity to make it work, or for example, an USB disk, we need to talk to the kernel. So kernel is everything in the operating system. Then we have the user space that we are using, for example, Google Chrome and all those softwares. So when we say Linux, we are not referring to an operating system. We are referring to a kernel. So when you find the word Linux, please don't say, I use Linux. Say something else. And this something else, let's discover what is this. So before we go and dive, this is what we call a kernel. And in the kernel, we have many versions. So if you go to kernel.org, this is a compiled and a ready version of what we call a kernel. So if you are able to understand what is this, that means that you can do anything you want. You can even go to a smart car or a smart device, because everything now, it's the word of smart everything. And when we say smart everything, there is a big chance that it's under Linux. So Linux, it's small, it's portable, and we can fit it in any device. So that's why everyone from Mercedes, from all those brands that try to do those smart cars, they come here and then they download the kernel and then they try to fit it to their needs. So the kernel, this is Linux. So remember, we don't say I use Linux. We say now, I use Linux distribution. So what is a distribution now? As you can see, you see this big graph. I will open it now. That's why I told you the pictorial image. That means that I can zoom and then we can see what's going on. And here is what we call distributions. All public distributions are here. Why we say public? Because we will see that in a few minutes. Don't worry. So we have Slackware for old people. They like Slackware. It's difficult. They like to, this is like the Arch Linux of the new era. And then what is important for us now, we are going to talk more about Debian and Red Hat. You see that small thing? But we are not going to focus on Red Hat. We are going to focus on Debian. Why Debian? Because this is what we are going to find on Google Cloud. Google Cloud use Debian and Ubuntu. We will see that in a few minutes, don't worry. So if I come to Red Hat and then search, for example, for CentOS, I find that CentOS, something like this, it's under Red Hat. What does it mean? That we have Linux, this is the kernel, and then we have like something like a grandfather distribution, the big distribution. The big distribution, we have Debian, and then we have Red Hat. I am talking about what is in the commercial business. I'm not talking about Arch Linux and all that stuff that you can use by yourself. I'm talking about what you are going to find in a business. So we are going to find two main distributions, Red Hat and Debian. So if we talk about Red Hat, all this is made on top of Red Hat. That means that if you say, hey, I am using EuroLinux, that means that you know how to use Red Hat. Now, if I come to Debian, which is what we are going to use now on, if I come here and then if I type Ubuntu, I will find that there are many Ubuntu, Kubuntu, Xubuntu, and if I come to the main tree, I want the plain Ubuntu. As you can see, Parrot, Linux, everything here. But what is the most important for us, as you can see, there is the Raspbian, which is the operating system of Raspberry Pi. We have the Solus Linux, we have Kali Linux. If I type here Kali Linux, Kali, come on, Kali, it's based on Debian. What does it mean? Is that when you use Kali and then you go to Debian, it will be easier to switch to Debian. And it will be much more easier than going to Red Hat. So if you use a distribution, you need to stick with a family. That's what we call a family. This is like a grandfather and then its son and so on. So if you go with Debian, you are going to go with Kali Linux, Ubuntu, Raspbian, and all those distributions. But if you want to stick with Red Hat, then you need to go with CentOS, Rocky Linux, and all the others. So you just go to Wikipedia and then search for Linux distribution, and then you can find everything. So Proxmox, as you can see, which is used in virtualization, it uses Debian. So that's why it's considered an operating system, because we need to boot using it. So if I come to, where is Ubuntu? I need Ubuntu. So we have, I will explain you why we call Xubuntu, Kubuntu, and all that. So if I come here, the latest operating system, this is Raspberry Pi OS, and bring me to Ubuntu. I don't want those small distribution. I want the original one. I'm using Ubuntu. I like using Ubuntu. I will explain you all that, don't worry. So if I come to Ubuntu Puji, Ubuntu Touch, Ubuntu, I need Ubuntu. Wow. As you can see, this is another big branch. So we have Ubuntu here, and then check this out. All those ones are derivated from Ubuntu. What does it mean? I mean something like, let me draw something, and then you will get the idea in much more professional way. We need those kind of trees because we need to know, does my command works or not? What do I mean by this? So let me choose a color that you can see. So here, for example, I think the red will work. And let me draw something. So if I say apt, the command apt, that works on Ubuntu. But I will ask myself, what if I go to Debian? Does it work? But before I go and ask about the parent, if I understand that, if I find that it works on the parent itself, that means that all those kids, let me bring back here, that means that all those kids, apt will work with them. That means that if I go to, for example, Ubuntu, Kylin, or KDE Neon, or Pop! OS, I can use apt. Now, if I come now and go to Debian and put apt, and if I find it working, we are not focusing about what it does. We are focusing about the question, does it work? So if we type apt and then it works, that means that every operating system that comes from this branch, it will work, including Raspbian, including Ubuntu, including Kali Linux. But as you can see, Debian, this is not the same as Red Hat. That means that if apt works only with Debian, it will not work with Red Hat. That's why Red Hat, they use their own command. For example, if I say yum or dnf, those two commands, we will discover them more and more. That means that all those other distribution, it will work on them. That means that Oracle Enterprise or Oracle Linux, they use yum or DNF. They don't use apt. But if we say something like ls, ls will work on all the operating system. So how we make our debug? We ask ourselves, does ls work on them? Yes, it works on Debian and it will work on Red Hat. That means that everything which is derivated from Red Hat, it will work. Everything which is derivated from Debian, it will work. But if we say, for example, apt or apt-get, and then here we put yum, that means that we cannot use by default yum on Debian, and we cannot use apt by default on Red Hat. But apt will work only on its derivation. So when we say I use Linux, please don't say again I use Linux. Say I use Red Hat or Debian or Ubuntu or Kali Linux. So you need to talk more about an operating system rather than a kernel. So Linux, this is a kernel. But be careful, there is something else that we call BSD. BSD, this is not Linux. This is another branch. This is another system. So when we say BSD, for example, Mac OS, this is based on BSD. This is not Linux. So BSD, you have FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and all that. But Linux, this is not BSD. So remember this. This is two different things, even if there are many commands that are shared between them. So now that we understand what is a distribution in Google Cloud, we need to ask ourselves, why do I need to learn Debian, or why do I need to learn Red Hat? So let's come here and we will find that Google used a special distribution that is called Ubuntu. Ubuntu, this is an Ubuntu-based operating system. Now they switch it to something called GLinux. So GLinux is based on Debian testing. What does it mean? That Google, they go to Debian, they contribute. You need to understand that that's Debian Google contribution. So if we come here, we will find that Google is from the big partners that develop Debian. So Debian, this is an open source operating system. That's why you will always find people talking about Debian, because there is no big brand behind it. It's not like Red Hat. But Google, they bring their contribution to Debian. So the way that open source works, because they are operating open source operating system, I give something and I take something. So this is how the open source works. I contribute to the source code, and then I take that source code and then I develop something which is for me. But in the other hand, I give my contribution. So what does it mean? Imagine you are a bank. As a bank, you are not going to use, for example, Windows XP. You are not going to use something which is deprecated or something that anyone can access to it, because if they can access to it, they can check how it works, and then they can find the flaws, they can find the bugs and the issues. So they will use the issues against you. So what does the bank? It takes the Linux, for example, the kernel, or they take a distribution, which is, for example, Debian, and then they hire engineers and they ask them, take this Debian, but change something in a way that anyone can't understand how it works. So if there is a hacker, if a hacker doesn't know what do you use, he cannot hack you. But if he knows what you are using, that means that there is a big chance that he can hack you. So Google, what they do, they come, they take Debian, which is the rolling release, which is the beta, which is not the final version, and then they do their operating system, and then they contribute to the community. And this operating system, this is called GLinux. You will not find it. GLinux, this is what Google use in their office or in their data centers. But if we create cloud functions, I think that you remember this from last year, but we are going to talk about this too. This year, if we create a container on cloud function, we are using Ubuntu 18.04, which is an LTS, which means that if we create something on Node.js or on Python, that container, it needs an operating system. And this operating system, this is Ubuntu 18.04. So this is what we use in a cloud function. There is an exception, which is an old Node.js 6. It will use an old version of Debian. So this is the first thing. So remember, Google, they use GLinux, but in the past they were using something which is, and GLinux is based on Debian. And then in the past they were using something called Ubuntu, and Ubuntu, it's based on Ubuntu. As you can see, we are always talking about Debian, the family. So we close this. And now what you use every day, if you go and buy a laptop, there is a big chance you will find it on ChromeOS. ChromeOS, it's based on an operating system that is called Gentoo. Gentoo Linux, or the Linux lovers, they know it. So if I come here and then type Gentoo, so Gentoo Linux, this is the operating system that works like ChromeOS. So this is not Gentoo Linux. This is something that is like Gentoo Linux, because ChromeOS, this is a proprietary operating system. So if I come to the Gentoo page, I will find that ChromeOS is an operating system used and developed almost exclusively by Google in order to be used on Chromebook hardware. ChromeOS is built using Portage, Gentoo Package Manager, and Gentoo-based CH roots. So that means that they took something from Gentoo and then they developed it to create something which is part of ChromeOS. So that's why you will find people saying, hey, it's based on Gentoo. It's not completely based on Gentoo. They took the package manager that we saw earlier using apt and yum. This is to install something. We need to install something that we are going to use several times in our sessions. And then they took the CH roots. I will explain you this when we get to the security side of the Linux system. So remember, every time we refer to Linux on our sessions, we are more referring on Ubuntu or Debian. But we don't say Linux. Linux, this is the kernel. But since this is like a language, something that we use a lot, you will hear people saying, I use Linux. But you need to ask him first, which Linux do you use? Which family you use? Once they say the family, which is, for example, Debian or Red Hat, here you ask him which distribution you use. He can use the Debian itself, but he can use Ubuntu. And then even Ubuntu, it has its children. So if I come back here and then I find, if I come here and then check about Ubuntu, and then I find that there are other operating systems that they are themselves based on Ubuntu. So we have Ubuntu here, and then, for example, PopOS, it's based on Ubuntu. So this is like, it's built on layers. So what do I mean by layers? This is something easier, something like this. Let me take a pen. So we have Linux, which is the kernel. And then we create something, for example, like Debian. People take Debian and create Ubuntu. People take Ubuntu and then they create PopOS. That's it. So if someone else come and take Linux, it's same Linux, and then he create Red Hat, and then from Red Hat they create something, for example, Rocky Linux. Rocky Linux, why I'm talking about Rocky Linux, because there in people CentOS, it's not the CentOS we used to know. This is like, just forget about CentOS. So either you use Red Hat or Rocky Linux. Rocky Linux, it's gaining popularity even on Google Cloud. There is an official operating system which is Rocky Linux. So it's supported by Google. That's why I talk about it. Okay, so now once we know what do we mean about this, as you can see, we always find something like Ubuntu, Lubuntu, Kubuntu. Why? Because in Linux, there is a feature which is really amazing. This feature is that they separate what is visual, this is the interface, from the operating system itself. What does it mean? That means that I can install an Ubuntu, but only the console. For example, that's what we call Ubuntu server. If you find Ubuntu server, that means that that term we use, we call it headless. For example, if you go and download Java, you will find the word headless. Headless, that means that it doesn't contain something for libraries for something visual. So for security reason, don't ever download something that you don't use. So if I have a server that doesn't have an interface, a visual interface, I don't need to download something that it has some libraries that works with this interface. That's why, for example, you will always find some SDKs that has headless. Headless, that means that it's used for something that doesn't need something like Windows. Windows, not the Windows, this window, something that you can use with the mouse. So this is we call headless. That means that you are only going to use the shell, the console. So we take Ubuntu and then we decide which interface we can use with it. And the interfaces we have, for example, KDE. So let's go to the image. So there are many interfaces and it's up for you to choose. That's the magic of Linux. You can change not only the desktop, because we have the desktop manager and we need to make a big difference. So here, that's what we call KDE. KDE, this is something like, it's full of effects, visual effects, and then we will talk more about GNOME. So GNOME, this is what we call GNOME. This interface, that's what we call GNOME. So if you find someone using this, that means that he decided to switch to GNOME, or the operating system, the distribution itself, it has GNOME by default. And then we have LXDE Linux. LXDE, this is like lightweight. So if you, in case you are using virtual machine, I advise you to use LXDE, but now it's not called LXDE anymore. It's called LXDQ for Qt. So, and then you have something else, which is, sorry, not LXDQ, LXQt. So LXQt, this is like LXDE, but it's like the newer one. And then you have Ubuntu. Ubuntu is based on, there are so many. I show you something before that. So this is another interface. And then, so if I type Ubuntu, yeah, it's based on, it's been a long time. I didn't use this one. So anyway, this is just something that visually you can customize. I will give you an example. As you can see, Windows, I have those three buttons here at the right. Even if I change the visual aspect of my Windows, I cannot bring those buttons here. I cannot. But in Linux, you can find those 3 buttons here. You can find some interface that don't even have those buttons. You can have some distribution that only have the close. You can have some distribution, they put them at the left. So that means that this is the same operating system, but the interface, you can play with it as you want. So that's the magic of Linux. So they are separated. And let me close this. But since we are going to use a server, we don't need a visual interface. But if you want to train on your own machine, you can find this, for example, LXDE. This is just easier. You can use the copy paste, you can use anything. So I'm using LXDE with Ubuntu on my virtual machine. So let's go now and check how Google is using those virtual machine. So the first place we find, Linux. The first place we find Linux, which is Debian, this is on Cloud Shell. So Cloud Shell, this is a temporary virtual machine that serves to do stuff, temporary stuff, downloading something, uploading something, but not in a virtual machine that you can use and host your application. So this is just a temporary virtual machine. Let me zoom here and let me show you something. So let me check if it's visible. Okay, I think it's clear now. Let me zoom again. Not like this. Let me unzoom. I think 215 is too much. Okay, let's bring this console. Yeah, because it's responsive and it's not made to be zoomed like this. Okay, so if I do the commands, we will see them in details next session. So if I do something like etc and OS release, as you can see, don't worry about the commands. We'll explain them in next session. It's based on Debian 10. So every Linux distribution, it has a version, but the version, they put something which is called codename. So you will hear more about the codename than the version itself. So when we say Buster, this is the 10. When we say Bullseye, this is the 11, and all those. So if I come here and then do Debian codenames, I will find that there are many codenames here. So we have those ones. So instead of saying 11, we say Bullseye. Instead of saying 12, which is the upcoming Debian, Bookworm, and then the Buster, this is the 10, and then Stretch, this is the 9, and so on. So even Ubuntu, it has its own code names. So if we come here, and then we will find they take animals and then they pick the name. So there is something I will tell you in a few minutes. What does it mean, this LTS? So we have the focal fossa, and then what is the other one? So let's go directly to this website, and then we will find them all. Okay, it's not detailed. No worries. Okay, let's go to Wikipedia. Okay, so all the versions, as you can see, this whole menu. Let's check them. So we have MP Shindri, Hirsute Hypo. What is this one? Focal Fossa, Cosmic, not this one. Bionic Beaver. Why I'm reading only those ones? Xenial Xerxes and Trusty Ta. Why I'm reading only this? Why I'm not reading those versions? You need to understand that in Linux, when something that is developed so fast, you need to stick with a stable version. So we have two schools. So let me use this one is better. So there are two schools. There are the school of normal people, normal daily users, and then we have the professionals. So the professionals, they need to stick about something which is stable. But normal people, they like to test something new. So this is the mindset when we use something in computer. And something new doesn't mean that it's always stable. And something new, there is a big risk that it breaks your own application because there are so many dependencies. We have the problem about dependencies. So the cutting edge, you will find the word cutting edge and new and all that. This is not made for something which is professional. Professional, they like stability. As long as it works, if I want to update it, I only need security patches. I don't need an update. If I have an old Ubuntu or an old Debian and it works and my server works perfectly using it, I will not risk it and then upgrade. So when you are in professional, you will always find something which is called LTS. LTS. So LTS, this is for long-term service. That means that I give you something and then I tell you, listen, I can update this operating system for 4 years. And then I will call it LTS. But if you bring something which is cutting edge, I will tell you this will be updated only for 6 months. So after 6 months, you need to upgrade to get new security patch. But if you take the LTS, I can provide for you 4 years of updates, or there are even who give 8 years. And this is why I told you earlier that CentOS people will not use CentOS, because in the past it was given as an update for enterprise. Now you want to use something like based on Red Hat, you need to go with Rocky Linux. Now, if you want to use something about Debian, use Debian or go for an Ubuntu that has something like 2 parts. We have something like 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, and so on, because 14 is deprecated. And now this number, remember, pick it 04. So when it's LTS, that means that this version is LTS, this version is LTS, this version will be LTS. And as you can see, they take so much time between those versions, 18 and 2004. But you will find 2010, something like this. This is not LTS. So this is a cutting edge that you can try for yourself, that you can find everything which works fine. But for enterprise, always go with a version that is something like 1804, 2004, 2204. Right now we are here in Ubuntu. We are in 2004, but 1804, it's still used and it's still deployed in servers, because when you have a server, you are not going to change your operating system from day and night. You need to think about a lot of things. So now let's go to Google Cloud and check. So as you can see, they use Debian, but it's not exclusive. It's not only Debian. So if you want to use your own Linux distribution, now here you just create a virtual machine. So I come to Compute Engine and then I create a new machine, and then you will see that there is not only Debian. Debian, it's used in Cloud Shell. Now you want to use something else than Debian, that's fine. I will show you the trick in a few minutes. Now if I go to create instance, you will see the difference between using something in the cloud and then something in a house. So if I come here and then choose the machine, I will go to the boot disk. By default, as you can see, this is the Debian. So I do change, and then here I can use something else. I can even change the version, the latest one, the 11, which is Bullseye. I can change Ubuntu. I can change Fedora. I can change Rocky Linux. As I said, it's supported by Google. It's updated. So when I say supported by Google, that means that when you install, for example, this Debian, this is not the same Debian that you download. So this is like updated and patched by Google. So every time there is a security flaw, Google patches this operating system. So that's why you need to stick with those operating system. So if I come here and then choose Ubuntu, as you can see, I have many Ubuntu, but always stick with those where it's written LTS. So 18 LTS or 20 LTS. And then you can use your operating system. But there is something. The difference between this way and then how you install an operating system in your own virtual machine is that in your own virtual machine, you need the ISO. You need this. So Ubuntu ISO. We need to download the ISO, and then once we download the ISO, we need to do the installation by ourselves. But when you are in the cloud, you don't need those steps. You just take a ready operating system. There is no ISO. So when I choose this is not an ISO that will tell me what do you want to install and all that. This is a ready operating system. This is the latest update. This is less than a week. So this is the main difference between installing our own operating system and then using something which is ready. So what Google did, they pick an operating system, they installed it. Once they finished it, they patched it, and then they did the update. And then once you run the virtual machine, you directly have this. This is the same thing if I do this. If I come and then activate Cloud Shell, it doesn't ask me which ISO do you want, which partition do you want, and all that. So as I said earlier, if you want to use something else than Debian on Cloud Shell, that's easy. Just do Docker. So if I do Docker run Ubuntu, it will bring Ubuntu, and I can use IT run Ubuntu bin bash. That's it. I'm in Ubuntu. So if I do cat etc OS release, and then that's fine. I'm using now Ubuntu. I'm not using Debian. So you can use, but it's up to you. So Cloud Shell, this is meant to use something temporary. So if you, for example, like using CentOS, that's fine. You just download using Docker. So let me quit this, and let me now come to some details. So the difference between Linux and Windows, or before that, let me see if there are some questions. So the first question, can everyone make their own Linux distribution? Yes, but it will be difficult. So for example, you can use this, Linux from scratch. Linux from scratch, this is something like you create something from the beginning. This is like, this is more made for, it will take some time to do it, because you are going to understand how hardware works, how software works, how operating system works, and you will need a lot of C programming language. So it's like, that's why people like to use Arch Linux. Arch Linux, this is like people who want to build their own operating system, but with more flexibility. But when you are in a professional corporate enterprise and all that, it's not allowed to use Arch Linux. This is like, use it on your laptop, on your risks. But when you are in corporate, there are something called stability. Even if Arch Linux is stable, but the standard are Debian and Red Hat. So another question. Yes, if you had with the default UI, can we switch? Yes, if you have, for example, this distribution, Ubuntu with LXD, you can try another one. So if I come here and then I just do install KDU in Ubuntu, just use this keyword, change KDE with GNOME or whatever. And then it will bring you for a lot of tutorials how you are going to install any interface. And then the difference is that when you log in the first time, it will ask you which, so let me try this and then you will see. So if I do exit, as you can see, I'm using an old, really minimal, because I'm using a virtual machine. So here I'm using a real minimal interface. So if I do exit, you will see now that it offers me GNOME. And then if I come here and if I come here, as you can see, I have OpenBox and Ubuntu. So OpenBox, this is like the strict minimum about interfaces, or I can use Ubuntu, which is the GNOME. So I can check here and then type my password, and then you will see that now I will have GNOME. But since I'm using a virtual machine, I don't want to be bothered with the resources that I give for my interface. Other questions? As you can see, the GNOME takes time because I'm using a virtual machine. I don't have the resources. So that's why I stick with the minimal or a headless Linux. So what is the purpose of Linux to deploy an app? So yes, I will answer about deploying an app on Linux, and then I will answer the question. Linux is open source. Remember this. So Linux, you will always find some commands that start with G. So if I come here, you will always find something like G. For example, gdit. So this is what we call GNU. So if I come here and then check GNU license, you will find this is like an old license that it's free. So we have many licenses. We have, for example, so Linux license, it's on GNU. And that's what you find called GPL. So we have GPL, we have BSD, we have many licenses. So it's a little bit complicated, the open source itself. So the open source, how it works, some people, some licenses tells you something like, okay, I give you the open source, the source code, you check about what's going on, but if you want to distribute it, don't close it. Don't close the source. You need to provide the same, even if you did something on that source, if you want to redistribute it, you need to distribute it on the same license. For example, I give you my application, I did an application, and then I tell you, okay, I give it to you for free, but you don't have the right to close it. If you want to close the source and make it proprietary for you, you need to pay me. So there are many licenses, but how it works? You need to understand that we are in a time where we don't pay for the software. We pay for the knowledge. How it works? I give you something. I give you, for example, OpenStack. Let's take OpenStack. OpenStack, this is free. This is to create your own cloud. And you can find a lot of tutorials about it. But people prefer to go and pay for the service. They hire people. And then that's why you will find always there are solutions that give you the free support and then the paid support. And this is the example with Red Hat, for example. Red Hat, you install it, that's fine. But if you have issues, if you have bugs, then you need the knowledge. So the knowledge, you will pay for it. And that's the mindset behind open source. I give you everything, but it's so complicated that you will invest much more time and then much money, and then it's risky. So I give you the same tool, it's open source, but I tell you, I will not charge you for the software. I will charge you for my knowledge. And this is what is working right now. So you can find a lot of applications that are open source, but people and enterprises they like to buy licenses, because when they buy licenses, there are contra, there are SLAs, there are like they respond for any issues, there are the assistants, there are so many details that you will prefer to pay rather than using something open source. But there are some tools that they are completely open source, and then we use them everything. For example, CURL, this is open source, and no one pays the guy. It's like developed by this guy, and he do it for pleasure, and it's stable. Okay, so let's check if there are other questions. So yeah, the source code, it's here. It's in Linux source, GitHub. You can find the source code here. You need a lot of C programming language. And if you want something like Debian, then you just type Debian source code, and then you will have everything. So you just download and then compile it by yourself. And that's how Arch Linux users likes to do. They like to compile their own kernel, and then sometimes there are some issues, and then from those issues, they learn. Okay, so other questions? Before we have still 10 minutes, I will do a demo, and then I explain you the main differences between Windows and Linux. So now the big question, do I use Windows or do I use something based on Linux? The answer is it depends. I know you hate this answer, but when you go, you will always hear about Windows Server. Windows Server, it's used in a corporate where you need to manage, for example, someone, he has his laptop and then he wants to access to something. So you want to restrict the access. And then you have many offices where you have thousands of users. You have thousands of printers. You have thousands of millions of folders. You cannot manage this by machine. So people use Windows Server not because Windows Server, but because of Active Directory. So when you go to enterprises, you will find everyone talking about Active Directory. And when you use Active Directory, even if you know what is LDAP, even if you know what is Samba, they exist on Linux, but people say, no, you need to use Active Directory. It's ready, it has its own DNS server, it has its own DHCP server, even if you find this on Linux, but they say, no, this is the standard. But when you want to host your own web server for security reasons and for libraries and open source, for example, I show you something that doesn't exist on Windows. This is like fork in Windows. Fork, this is like, it doesn't exist on Windows. So you need to use it on Linux. So that's why, for example, Redis, it doesn't work on really on Windows, even if you will find a version. Why? Because it doesn't have a fork. Fork is running something in the background. So this is special for Linux. And then we have a lot of other stuff on Linux that doesn't exist on Windows. For example, if we have Ep1 function, this is for asynchronous programming, asynchronous network programming. And this is how Node.js runs, let's call it 10K network problem. This is called 10K. The 10K, this is, you cannot host something and then accept more than 10K connection at the same time. So in Apache, Apache web server, that was an issue. And now the new way is using async and await and all those libraries. Those libraries in the bottom, they use Ep1. which doesn't exist on Windows. And there is something which is important now, which is Docker. Docker doesn't run on Windows. You need to run something between. That's why when you run Docker on Windows, in old Windows, you need VirtualBox, or in new Windows, you need WSL for Windows Subsystem Linux. So to run Docker, Windows needs to install this without telling you to make it run, because Docker runs only on Linux, because it has what we call C groups that we saw, and then we will see again. So how to separate process and then make CH roots and all those details that we will see in next session, inshallah. So we have still 5 minutes, and do you mean GNOME? It's heavy on VirtualBox. A little bit, because every interface, it needs GPU, it needs your graphic card. So when you use a VirtualBox is not good with OpenGL. VMware is better. But to avoid all this, personally, I don't use Linux for its interface. I use it for the command line. That's why I prefer to have the strict minimum. I don't want to see something beautiful here. I want to have something that works. This is like I go to Google Cloud and then I run something like Cloud Shell. I need to practice the commands. I don't need to use my mouse. That's why I prefer to use something lightweight like LXDE or OpenBox, just to run the command line, not to use the graphical interface. Okay, so let's go now for the latest thing, which is the difference between Windows and Linux, which is important. So if I come here and then do man, this command like this, that means give me the manual, and then all the commands, we will see that in the next session. We will detail them. This is just to show you something. So Linux, it has a standard which is called the file system hierarchy. It's a standard, FHS, Linux file hierarchy system, a standard. So we have always this, which is the root. And then we have bin. So all executables, the system, this is equivalent for Windows System 32. So let me draw something. So let me show you another image on Google. So Linux FH. So this is the file system, and this is standard. So this one, open image in new tab. Oh, it's small. So let's take another big one. Okay, let's come here, and for example, this one. Okay, this one is better. It's PNG. Okay, so here we have the root, and then in the root we have many folders, but they are standard everywhere. Any distribution from Linux, Debian or Red Hat, you will find them. We have the bin. The bin, this is equivalent for System 32 on Windows. We have the boot. This is where we boot. Here, that means device. So the screen and all that, they are here. And then the device, we have sys. Where is sys? Sys. It's not here. No problem. So this must be the old one. etc. This is the most important. If you know how to use etc, this is not etc for French. This is for editable text configuration. So all the configuration, it's here. The network configuration, everything is here. And the home, this is equivalent for home on Windows. This is where there is the desktop. This is where the users have their sessions. And media and MNT, this is where we mount our disks and all that. And then we have the temp for temporary. And then we have the OPT. This is when we install our own software, it goes to OPT. This is equivalent for program files. And then SBin, this is the same as bin, But to use something in SBIN, we need to use sudo. All that we will see that in different session. But in Windows, there is the C, there is the D, there is the E. But in Linux, there is one single root, and all those ones, they are just here. They are just folders that, for example, media or MNT C, MNT D. All that we will see that in future sessions, but there is always one single root, which is the disk itself. So the root, that's why we say I rooted my phone. That means that I became that user, which is the root. So we will see all that in next session. So before we end, do you have other questions? And you can find everything using man, but all this, as I said, today is just a presentation about what is Linux. Now I hope you will not say Linux, you will say more about distribution. I use Debian, I use Ubuntu and all. Learning Linux, all YouTube is full of Linux. You just go and type Linux and I'm pretty sure you will find everything. From the beginner, I cannot, in 2022, personally, I don't recommend any personal someone or this one. I ask people go to YouTube because everyone has his own way to learn. Some people like to have longer videos. Some people like to check 5-minute videos. Some people like long tutorials. Some people like small tutorials. So that's why I tell them go to YouTube, type Ubuntu, and then you will have a full playlist about everything about Linux. But don't type Linux. Type something specific like Ubuntu or Red Hat or Debian or Rocky Linux or anything which is specific. And please don't learn Kali Linux before you don't even know what is etc. And that's the mistake people do. They go to Kali Linux and they don't even know where is the configuration file. So in those sessions, inshallah, within the year, we will discover everything about Linux because this is what we use heavily. Do you have any other questions? I hope I answered all the questions. Sorry if I forgot one. Yeah, about the app, we will see that. I prefer we will detail that in next session because we will do the heavy network, we will do everything. Just before we finish, can you please add me 10 minutes? I need 10 other minutes and then we will finish. So let me show you something. So in Debian here, I will use a command that's called, so sorry, I zoomed too much. Okay, let me do something. So let me do dmsg. I will show you all those commands next time, and then do something like grep eth0. I will let this like this, and then that's why I hate those interfaces. Okay, no, just so this, and then let me run terminal, and let me run this, the same thing. Okay. I need the sudo. I will explain you after why do I use sudo, and then grep eth0, and then sorry, okay, and then at the end I will add this, and then sudo dmsg grep eth0, just to show you something, because we are in the cloud, we need to understand how network works. So now you will see this word eth0 for Ethernet 0. So I will explain you next time why each time you will find it with a different name. For example, in VMware, we find it named ENS33. In VirtualBox, we will find it named ENS0S3. And in the cloud, we will find it ETH0 because it was renamed like this. So we will discover why we need this VETH and all that. That's what we are going to do this year. We are going to do something professional, but we are going to go step by step and explain you all that stuff. But in Linux, in Windows, I don't think we can do that. That's why I prefer to use it on Linux to explain you more how it works. And every time I say Linux, remember, either I use Debian or Ubuntu. So when I am in Cloud Shell, I'm in Debian. When I am in my machine, I use Ubuntu, but it's the same because Ubuntu is based on Debian. So that will be the same. Okay, do you have any questions? Thank you very much. ثانمير ثنون شكرا جزيلا لكم. If you have any questions, if you don't have, then see you next month, inshallah. Please stay safe. And I hope in this month you are going to do some researches about Ubuntu or Debian. So in next month, we will work together. Thank you very much and stay safe.